The Nigeria Democratic Congress presidential candidate Peter Obi yesterday urged President Bola Tinubu to take a cue from British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and step down from office.
In 2014, then Lagos Governor Bola Tinubu publicly called on President Goodluck Jonathan to resign. His reason, the government had failed in its most fundamental duty, protecting lives. Specifically, he cited the Chibok school kidnapping. On Monday, June 22, 2026, former Anambra Governor Peter Obi called on President Bola Tinubu to resign. His reason, the government has failed in its most fundamental duty, protecting lives. He cited the Oriire school kidnapping. While everyone is debating whether Obi's comparison of Tinubu to the British PM is fair, nobody is asking the more uncomfortable question: does Tinubu's own 2014 resignation demand against Jonathan, made for the exact same reason Obi is making against him, mean that Tinubu himself established the standard by which he is now being judged? Because if the answer is yes, the presidency's response to Obi on Monday is not a constitutional argument, it is an evasion, and I want to show you exactly why. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media won't. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. On Monday morning, June 22, 2026, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, announced his planned resignation, stating that his party had questioned whether he was best placed to lead them into the next general election and that he had heard the answer. His departure followed months of internal Labour pressure, poor local election results, and declining public approval ratings over a stagnant UK economy and a worsening cost of living crisis. Within hours of Starmer's announcement, Peter Obi, the NDC presidential candidate for the 2027 Nigerian election and the Labour Party's 2023 presidential flag-bearer, posted a statement on his X account titled "Owning Up to Leadership Failures and Political Responsibility." In it, he drew a direct line from Starmer's resignation to Nigeria's governance situation and called on President Tinubu to resign. First, Obi compared Tinubu's conditions to Starmer's: a stagnant economy, a worsening cost of living crisis, and unmet campaign promises. He described Nigeria's situation as the worst possible condition. Second, Obi cited Tinubu's own 2023 campaign statement, in which Tinubu told voters not to re-elect him if he failed to deliver on his promises, specifically stable power supply, anti-corruption, and improved welfare. Obi argued that those conditions had worsened, not improved. Third, and this is the detail most commentators missed, Obi explicitly reminded his audience that Tinubu himself called for the resignation of President Goodluck Jonathan during the 2014 Chibok kidnapping on the grounds that the government had failed in its duty to protect lives. Fourth, Obi called on Tinubu to resign over what he described as monumental failure in governance across security, electricity, infrastructure, transportation, and anti-corruption. Presidential spokesman Bayo Onanuga issued a swift counter-statement describing Obi's call as childish, hollow, misplaced, and undemocratic. First, the presidency argued that Nigeria runs a presidential system, not a parliamentary one like the UK, and that Tinubu was elected to a fixed 4-year term. A British PM is first among equals who can be removed by parliamentary confidence. A Nigerian president cannot. Second, the presidency cited the weekend off-cycle election victories in Ekiti State and several senatorial by-elections in Nasarawa, Enugu, Ondo, and Rivers as evidence that the electorate are passing a vote of confidence on the Tinubu amendment. Third, the presidency said Tinubu did not inherit the country in perfect shape and had made significant measurable progress despite inherited security challenges. Fourth, the statement told Obi to wait until the presidential election to know what the people think and described the ex-post as an attempt to harangue the president out of office, framing it as anti-democratic. This exchange did not happen in a vacuum. The specific timing, June 22, 2026, places it at the convergence of multiple pressure streams. The Oriire school abduction, May 15th, remains unresolved with children in captivity. VDM's Ibadan protest, June 16th, was met with armed thugs. VDM received an EFCC invitation, June 20th. The Ekiti election, June 20th, produced an APC victory the presidency immediately framed as a national endorsement. And then Starmer resigned, giving Obi a global accountability moment to attach his long-building governance critique to. The Starmer comparison is the vehicle. The cargo is everything that has been accumulating since May 15th. The presidency's strongest argument in this exchange is also its most accurate one. Nigeria does not run a Westminster parliamentary system. Under Section 143 of the 1999 Constitution, a Nigerian president can only be removed from office through A. Impeachment by the National Assembly, requiring a two-thirds majority in both chambers following a prescribed investigation process, or B. The President's own voluntary resignation, submitted in writing to the Vice President. No petition, no public call, no election result, and no comparison to foreign leaders can compel a Nigerian president to resign. The constitutional mechanics are explicit. A British Prime Minister, by contrast, holds office only as long as they command the confidence of their parliamentary party. Starmer did not resign because voters demanded it. He resigned because his own MPs signaled they would not back him into the next election. That distinction is real, substantial, and important. Peter Obi knows it. His statement acknowledges the comparison is about political responsibility and honor, not constitutional compulsion. The concept Obi is invoking, that leaders who fail should voluntarily step aside rather than clinging to power, exists in political culture, not in constitutional law. It is the same argument that drove Yakubu Gowon to resign his commission after the 1975 coup, that drove Richard Nixon to resign rather than face Senate impeachment conviction, and that led to Harold Macmillan's resignation over the Profumo affair. In none of these cases was resignation constitutionally required. In each case, the political cost of staying was deemed higher than the personal cost of leaving. Tinubu's political calculation is the reverse. The political cost of resigning, ceding the presidency, allowing a successor process, dismantling a 3-year patronage network, is far higher than the political cost of weathering Obi's statement and the presidency's response. That calculus does not change regardless of governance performance, and Obi knows this too.
The most analytically significant element of Obi's statement is the Chibok citation. It establishes that Tinubu himself in 2014 made a public resignation demand on a sitting Nigerian president on the grounds of security governance failure. In 2014, Tinubu used exactly the same argument Obi is now using against him. The government failed to protect lives, specifically children, and that failure warrants leadership accountability. The presidency's rebuttal did not address this specific point. It did not explain why the argument Tinubu made in 2014 does not apply to Tinubu in 2026. That silence is itself an institutional data point. It suggests the presidency recognizes that answering the Chibok-Oriire comparison directly would require either defending Tinubu's 2014 position, which would validate Obi's argument, or criticizing it, which would require Tinubu to criticize himself. Neither option is available, so the presidency does not engage it. The presidency's claim that off-cycle state elections constitute a resounding vote of confidence for the federal government deserves institutional scrutiny. Off-cycle governorship and by-elections in Nigeria have historically low voter turnout compared to general election cycles. They are less mobilized, less nationally contested, and more susceptible to local machine politics. APC winning Ekiti is stated as controlled since 2018, with an incumbent governor in a 14-candidate fragmented opposition field, is an expected result, not a national referendum. The senatorial by-elections in Nasarawa, Enugu, Ondo, and Rivers were similarly local contests. Using these results to claim national endorsement for a federal administration's economic and security record is a significant analytical overreach.
Peter Obi is the NDC's 2027 presidential candidate. He ran in 2023 on the Labour Party platform. His obedient movement generated genuine mass enthusiasm, particularly among youth voters, but he lost the election, finishing third in the official result, with an ongoing legal challenge at the time. Since then, he has been repositioning, moving from Labour Party to NDC, rebuilding a national donor and organizer network, and building a platform for 2027. His June 22 statement is a precision instrument for that repositioning. It does several things simultaneously. It keeps him in the national conversation during a news cycle dominated by the Starmer resignation. It invokes a specific governance accountability standard, Tinubu's own 2014 words, that Tinubu cannot refute without contradicting himself. It attaches his 2027 campaign to the accumulated national frustration over Oriire, over economic hardship, over power failures. And it does all of this in a single ex-post that costs nothing and generates maximum earned media coverage. The resignation call will not succeed in its stated objective. Tinubu will not resign. Obi knows this. The objective is not to remove Tinubu now. It is to establish for the record and for the 2027 campaign that Obi raised the accountability question loudly and publicly, while the presidency's response was to call him childish. The presidency's response, rapid, dismissive, personally attacking, also reveals a specific political calculation, By describing Obi as childish and hollow, the presidency is not engaging with the governance claims. It is attempting to reduce Obi to a category of political nuisance rather than a legitimate accountability challenger. The choice to use contemptuous language, childish, hollow, simplistic, rather than substantive rebuttal, tells you more about the presidency's internal assessment of Obi's statement than any direct engagement would. The presidency chose to cite Ekiti election rather than address the Oriire comparison. That choice reveals which argument they found harder to answer. They can counter a parliamentary versus presidential systems argument easily and accurately. They cannot counter the image of 46 children still in a forest while the government sends an EFCC invitation to the man who led a protest demanding their rescue. The Obi-Tinubu exchange crystallizes the 2027 electoral frame earlier and more sharply than most expected. Obi's NDC platform is positioning itself as the national accountability candidate, the force arguing that Nigeria deserves the same standard of governance responsibility it expects of other democracies. The presidency's response, wait for the election, inadvertently legitimizes that frame by conceding that the election is where the accountability question will be settled. That is exactly where Obi wants the argument to land. For Atiku Abubakar and the ADC, and for Peter Mbah's PDP, and for other 2027 opposition figures, Obi's June 22nd statement also serves as an implicit challenge. Are you willing to make this accountability argument as explicitly as Obi just did? The question for every opposition candidate in 2027 is not just what will you offer, but are you willing to name what has failed? The presidency's rebuttal mentioned Enugu State senatorial by-election as one of the resounding victories vindicating Tinubu. Enugu is a southeast state, predominantly Igbo, the same region as Peter Obi. An APC senatorial victory in Enugu is not a trivial data point in this context. It is being used by the presidency to signal that even Obi's home region is endorsing Tinubu's direction. Whether the Enugu by-election result is genuinely transferable to presidential-level sentiment is a question for careful analysis. The Southeast response to Obi's statement will be watched carefully, because Obi's 2027 campaign depends heavily on the Southeast delivering numbers that his 2023 campaign did not fully consolidate. If the Southeast reads Obi's resignation call as principal accountability demand, it strengthens his positioning there. If they read it as political opportunity, as Rotimi Fasan argued in Vanguard, it complicates his 2027 Southeast consolidation. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything.
Obi cited 5 governance failure areas: electricity supply, insecurity, specifically kidnappings, economic hardship, infrastructure/transportation regression, and anti-corruption regression. Each of these claims is independently verifiable and has been documented by multiple Nigerian economic and security research bodies. Nigeria's electricity generation capacity has not improved materially since 2023. The Oriire kidnapping is the most visible but not the only major security incident of 2026. Inflation and cost of living indicators have worsened since the subsidy removal in June 2023. Infrastructure investment has been concentrated in Lagos-centric corridors rather than distributed nationally. The EFCC's independence has been questioned by civil society groups in multiple published reports. The governance failure argument is not Obi's invention. It is documented across multiple independent sources. Obi's citation of Tinubu's own 2023 campaign statement, in which Tinubu challenged voters not to return him for a second term if he failed to deliver on electricity, corruption, and welfare, is the most constitutionally significant element of the exchange. It is not a resignation demand grounded in parliamentary convention. It is a resignation demand grounded in the president's own explicit campaign promise. That distinction matters for how the 2027 election campaign can be legally and legitimately framed. The accountability standard being applied is one Tinubu himself proposed. The cost of living crisis that contributed to Starmer's resignation in the UK is objectively more severe in Nigeria by multiple economic metrics. The Naira's value has declined significantly against the dollar since 2023. Food inflation remains among the highest in Nigeria's modern history. Fuel prices following the subsidy removal have not stabilized at a level ordinary Nigerians can absorb. These are not Obi's claims. They are Central Bank of Nigeria data, World Bank Nigeria Economic Update figures, and NBS Consumer Price Index reports. The economic hardship argument that Obi is making is the most empirically grounded of his 4 governance claims.
On the same day that Starmer resigned and Obi invoked him as a model of accountability, the Nigerian government signed a formal agreement with the UK Home Office on migration and criminal justice cooperation. The agreement, signed by Interior Minister Olubunmi Tunji Ojo and UK Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, facilitates the return of failed Nigerian asylum seekers and convicted Nigerian criminals from Britain to Nigeria. The political irony is sharp.
Obi is holding up Britain as a model of leadership accountability, while the Nigerian government is deepening a deportation partnership with Britain that will send Nigerians who fled the conditions Obi is describing, economic hardship, insecurity, governance failure, back to those conditions. The two stories, running simultaneously on June 22, tell a more complete account of the UK-Nigerian relationship than either the Starmer comparison or the deportation deal alone. For Nigerian diaspora communities in the UK, many of whom have been following both the Oriire kidnapping and the VDN EFCC petition with growing concern, the UK-Nigerian deportation deal is a direct threat. Nigerians in the UK who are on uncertain immigration status are now in a country whose government has formalized a rapid return pipeline to a country that filed EFCC petitions against protest organizers and failed to rescue kidnapped school children in 33 days. Obi's statement, because it was framed in comparative international terms, resonated strongly in diaspora communities. It gave diaspora Nigerians in the UK a domestic political articulation of what they are observing from abroad, that the Nigerian government's governance failures are not just statistical abstractions, but lived conditions that explain why hundreds of thousands of Nigerians sought to leave in the first place. The Vanguard analysis by Rotimi Fasan makes a point that must be engaged honestly. Starmer did not resign voluntarily. He resigned because Labour MPs and cabinet members signaled they would not back him into the next election. He was, in Fasan's formulation, a band leader without a chorus. That is accurate. Starmer's resignation was not an act of selfless democratic virtue. It was the consequence of losing internal party confidence in a system where such confidence is institutionally measurable and removable. Obi's use of the Starmer resignation as a model is therefore partially imprecise. He is praising the outcome of a parliamentary confidence mechanism and suggesting it reflects a personal virtue that Tinubu should emulate. But the mechanism does not exist in Nigeria's constitutional structure. The comparison holds as a political culture argument. Leaders should hold themselves accountable, but it does not hold as a constitutional equivalence. Your analysis must hold both truths simultaneously. The broader global pattern that Obi's statement connects to is the increasing use of Westminster political culture, accountability, resignation, no confidence motions, as a standard against which presidential systems in the global south are judged by their own citizens. This is not unique to Nigeria. Similar comparisons have been made in Kenya, Ghana, and Zambia, where opposition leaders have invoked British, German, or Scandinavian accountability norms to frame their domestic governance critiques. The pattern reflects a real citizen aspiration for higher governance standards and a real frustration that constitutional structures in presidential systems make those standards harder to enforce.
The presidency's most accurate and intellectually defensible argument is the constitutional systems argument. Nigeria and the UK have fundamentally different governance structures. A British PM serves at the pleasure of their parliamentary party. A Nigerian president serves a constitutionally fixed 4-year term elected by a national popular vote, or, under the current result, by a plurality with a court-validated mandate. Calls for resignation that ignore this structural distinction are, in a narrow constitutional sense, making a category error. The electorate chose a fixed-term president. The mechanism for accountability is the 2027 election, not an ex post from a rival presidential candidate. The governance inheritance argument also has some merit. Tinubu took office in May 2023, inheriting a naira in managed devaluation, a fuel subsidy consuming 4.7 trillion naira annually, and security conditions that had been deteriorating since 2015. The subsidy removal, however painful in the short term, was a reform multiple previous administrations refused to execute. Crediting or debiting the current administration requires acknowledgement of what it inherited. Misconceptions in public discourse. 1. Obi's call means he thinks Tinubu will actually resign. Obi is a sophisticated political actor. He knows the constitutional reality. His call is a 2027 campaign instrument, not a genuine expectation of executive departure. 2. The presidency proved Obi wrong by citing the Ekiti election. The Ekiti election is a single-state off-cycle result in an APC stronghold. It does not measure national presidential approval. Presenting it as a national referendum on Tinubu's federal governance is a rhetorical claim, not an electoral analysis. 3. Starmer resigned because he was honorable. As Fasan correctly notes in Vanguard, Starmer resigned because he had lost internal parliamentary support. Honor and political survival are not the same thing. Obi's comparison is stronger as a political culture argument than as a characterization of Starmer's personal motivations. 4. This is a story about Peter Obi versus Tinubu. The more consequential story is what this exchange reveals about the nature of accountability in Nigeria's constitutional architecture, and whether the 2027 election cycle will produce a genuine accountability contest or another incumbent machine versus fragmented opposition outcome.
Nigeria's long-term political and economic interest is not served by either a forced resignation or by pretending governance failures do not exist. The genuine national interest is in a political culture where leaders are held to the standards they themselves set, publicly, specifically, and on the record. Tinubu's 2014 Chibok call and his 2023 "Don't Vote Me for a Second Term" commitment are on the public record. Obi's June 22 statement has placed them on the 2027 accountability ledger. Whether that ledger is the deciding factor in 2027 depends on whether the opposition can maintain disciplined accountability messaging, or whether it fragments, as in 2023, into multiple competing platforms that collectively fail to consolidate the anti-incumbent vote. The Southwest-specific dimension is this: a Tinubu presidency that begins its 2027 re-election campaign having failed to rescue Oriire children, having deployed EFCC petitions against protest organizers, and having dismissed accountability demands as childish, is a presidency that has given the opposition a specific, documented, emotionally resonant campaign argument. Whether the opposition uses it effectively is the question. Whether it is true is not in dispute.
The Obi-Tinubu exchange of June 22, 2026 will be cited in 2027 campaign materials, not because anyone will resign, but because it placed three specific facts on the public record simultaneously: that Tinubu himself set the accountability standard in 2014, that he set it again in 2023, and that a named 2027 challenger applied that standard publicly and was called childish for doing so. In a campaign that will be fought partly on accountability and partly on economic management, that exchange is a piece of political infrastructure that will not go away. The long-term structural question this exchange raises is the one neither man answered. What would it actually take to build a Nigerian political culture in which leaders who fail do not need to be forced out because the political cost of staying exceeds the personal cost of leaving? That is not a 2027 question. It is a generational one. But the Oriire children, still in captivity as this analysis is written, are the most urgent human argument for why that question cannot wait another generation to be answered. We opened with a specific factual reversal. Tinubu in 2014 called on Jonathan to resign over a school kidnapping. In 2026, Obi called on Tinubu to resign over a school kidnapping. The presidency responded. Neither side mentioned the Oriire children by name. That omission is the answer to the question this video posed. The exchange between Obi and the presidency was not primarily about governance accountability. It was about 2027 positioning, political branding, and the management of public narrative. The children in the forest are the evidence both sides are citing. Neither side has produced a plan to get them home. A resigned Tinubu does not rescue Oriire children. A re-elected Tinubu does not automatically rescue them. What rescues them is operational capacity, political will, and federal-state security coordination that neither a resignation call nor a presidency rebuttal provides. That is the accountability question underneath the accountability statement, and it is the one Nigerian political analysis channels have an obligation to keep asking. Drop your analysis in the comments. Is Obi's resignation called principled accountability or 2027 positioning? And can it be both? And what would genuine governance accountability look like in Nigeria's constitutional structure if resignation is not on the table? If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.